Good evening and welcome once again to Letchworth Cable Access. I'm Kyle Adamczak, and tonight we have as our guest the Reverend Donald Vogel, who I'm sure you all know from the First Congregational Church in Perry Center. And he's here to talk with us tonight. He's going to share some of his memories of World War II. He was around at that time, believe it or not.
Oh, yes.
And this is part of the World War II project that the Library of Congress has asked us to do, to record memories of people who were alive at the time and served in the armed forces. So let's get started. What were you doing before the war started in the late 1930s, or at least before the United States was involved in it? Do you remember?
Well, yes, of course, I was in high school at the time. At the time of Pearl Harbor, in fact, I remember the incident very well. Of course, most of us who are my age would remember that sort of thing, what we were doing. Very much like when some big thing happens, the Kennedy assassination, where were you or what were you doing? Well, we remembered that. It was a little difficult because we knew what our fate was going to be. We had to register for the draft, and we were at war now with Japan and Germany, the Central Powers, Italy, and so on. We knew that there was no college for us. There was nothing along that line. As soon as we were out of high school, we were going to the Army, and that was all there was to it.
Now, were you in high school when Pearl Harbor was
Yes,
hit?
I was in high school at the time. As it happened in it's the 6th of December, 7th of December.
Sunday.
6th of June was the invasion of Normandy. It was the 7th, yeah. I was in school, yeah, but I was graduated and had to register, and by fall I was in the Army. And many of the fellas, they were taken right out of school. You can imagine what would happen today if you took a fellow out of school and put him in the Army. It was my brother was due to graduate in June, and in April they drafted him, took him, sent him down to Camp Landing, put him in the 30th Infantry Division, sent him over to Europe. He never did get to graduate himself, my dad, and he wasn't alone. Many of the class, we'd taken a lot of casualties, and we were getting the kids right out of high school, putting them right in the service and sending them right into battle.
Now, when the news came out of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was a Sunday morning, do you remember where you were, what was going on?
Yes. Interestingly enough, I was at church. Of course, it was Sunday morning in Pearl Harbor, but it was late in the afternoon here in Rochester. I was from Rochester, and I was at a youth meeting at church. And someone came in and said, Pearl Harbor is attacked. And of course, 90% of us, where's Pearl Harbor? What's that? So we had a radio in those days. There was no television. We turned on the radio, and here they were talking about this attack on Pearl Harbor. Of course, that put a damper on the rest of the meeting. We all sat around pretty somber because we knew what that had meant. We'd been registered for the draft ahead of time, and now, obviously, we were in the war, and the fellas looked at each other, and that was it. And we went home. It was a gray, kind of a snowy December afternoon when we got that information. It was, late in the afternoon, about 6 o'clock in the evening. And that was it. From then on, our future was laid out for us.
Now, you said you joined the service in the fall of 1942.
Yes.
Now, you were drafted, or did you volunteer?
Drafted.
Yeah.
I tried for the Navy, and my eyesight wasn't all that good. And in those days, they say, well, wait and we'll put you in the Army. So I was rejected in the Navy, and then a month or so later, I was put in the Army and sent down to Fort Niagara. And from there, of course, that was just the induction center. Oh, it was cold, the snow was deep. And from there, I went to Alabama. And I did my training down there in northern Alabama.
Now, what did you train for in Alabama?
Well, I had done some work as, believe it or not, a prosthetic dental technician, making false teeth. And so they saw laboratory work, and they put me in chemical warfare initially. And I was in chemical warfare most of my career in the Army.
Now, what were some of your duties? What were you
doing?
Well,
the duty was originally, of course, we had to work on gas masks and impregnated clothing and things like that in case of a gas attack, because of course that had happened in World War I.
Right.
Gas was, and we never knew what would happen, and so I was in that. But then once I'd gotten overseas, and I'd trained for it in Alabama too. We went out of San Francisco, Camp Stoneman, and we were maintaining flamethrowers. That was part of the chemical warfare thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned all about a flamethrower, and we'd put them together, tested them out, and attached ourselves to the infantry. I think I was in the 23rd Infantry Division or something like that, and most of my time was spent with the infantry maintaining these flamethrowers.
Now, did you go overseas with
Oh,
them?
yes, yeah.
Now, were they used just in the Pacific, or were they
Well, I
used...
have no idea. I
Oh.
was just in the Pacific, and I would imagine they
No,
were
but
in
you
Europe.
went to the Pacific.
I was in the Pacific.
Okay.
We left out of Camp Stoneman in 1943. It was.
Yes.
And I was 23 days at sea. 31 days. 31 days at sea. I was only sick the first 5 days. After that, you either got
your
well or you
legs.
died. And the ship went south. We were alone. We weren't in convoy. Down off Peru, South America, and then cut out west toward the South Pacific, toward Australia and New Caledonia. The reason for that circuitous trip was because of the fact the Japanese had taken all of the central islands in the Pacific. You couldn't go anywhere. You had to go way south. And then after 31 days, we landed at New Caledonia, and from there it was the same ship. We went north to New Guinea. Lae was the first, Milne Bay, then Lae, and then Finschhafen. And it was in the New Guinea campaign, and that's where I got my first my first battle star in that area.
Before we get to the New Guinea campaign, I'd like just a couple more memories about the voyage on the ship.
Yes.
Besides being sick, after you got well, what was it like? Was it very crowded? Was the food
Yeah,
good?
it was pretty quiet. Oh, well,
Did you have
in the
enough?
Army, the food is never good, no matter how good it is.
I thought the Navy had the best food.
Yeah, well, the Navy did have the best food. That's why I wanted to get in the Navy in the first place, but they wouldn't take me, so I had stuck with the Army.
Stuck with Army.
Yeah,
K-rations.
it was a 5-hold ship. I've forgotten the name of it. I think it was a Sea Scamp, and it was something like a little larger than a Liberty ship, but it was merchant marine, and there was no Navy connected with
Okay,
it. We
so
were on our own all the way
in
down.
a merchant ship then.
It was a merchant ship, troop transport. The merchant ship had been converted into a troop transport, and there were 5 holds, and I would imagine probably could have been maybe 4,000 or 5,000 soldiers on board that thing.
Yeah.
And we went over and got down to New Caledonia. It was, of course, there's always a compensation. We got in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and of course, everything was lights out. You couldn't have any light at all. A cigarette, a match, would show a mile away in pitch blackness, and you could have no light at all. But the compensation was, if you stood on the deck in the middle of the Pacific with no distracting lights and looked at the sky, you got a most unbelievable picture of the universe. Every star, the faintest star, and it was just magnificent. The stars in the darkness, and we were 1,000 miles from any light, so we got the full picture. The only time in my life that ever happened, where I was completely away from light. Gorgeous. Just
Quite
gorgeous.
overwhelming, I bet.
Oh, it was.
It makes me dizzy to think of
The
it.
first time we got down there, we got out, and it was a little cloudy. Once we were out there maybe 3 or 4 days way out in the Pacific. So, Don, come up on deck, come up on deck. I came up on deck, and there I saw it. Just unbelievable. Never saw anything like it since, because we see just the bright ones around here, And even if we're in the field, in the country here, there's still a light from Warsaw and the various towns around, so it fades out. But beautiful, just beautiful. That was the one thing I remember on my trip over.
Yeah. Now, the New Guinea campaign, when you think of that, what's the first thing comes to your mind as far as a memory of it?
The first time we approached New Guinea, it was a thick jungle. New Guinea's the second largest island in the world after Greenland. The Owen Stanley Mountains are across the back of New Guinea. They're snow-capped. You don't think of a Pacific island with snow-capped mountains. And it was not an atoll or anything like that. It was a really solid island. But the jungle was there, and steam was rising off the jungle. That's the humidity. And I looked at that. It looked like something out of King Kong that I saw back in 1932. There's the steam coming off the jungle. The next thing was the mud. Boy, the mud was something else again. The tanks and so on churned up the mud, and then we'd have to try to get through that. The Australian Army was there. Those fellas were great guys. They wore big hats tipped up on one side, their sleeves rolled up. Wonderful fellas, and of course they were defending their homeland because New Guinea was just north of Australia.
Right.
So that was very, very interesting. I didn't see a lot of action down there. There were some Japanese prisoners. What amazed me were the natives, extremely Stone Age primitive types back in the jungles there. And once we got in there, I understand they didn't take kindly to our Japanese enemies, but they were pretty decent to us. What I saw of them, that was about the most remarkable thing. Afterward, of course, there were still a few battles to be fought, but MacArthur would island hop. He would not, the same group would not go island to island to island. They'd take one island and then move, may not be on the next campaign or even maybe the next one, but then the second or third one they would, so that you didn't burn yourself out. Now, when I was there, Guadalcanal was just across the strait, and there was a lot of heavy fighting over there in Guadalcanal. But they needed, well, we continued to service the flamethrowers until the idea of invading the Philippines. We didn't do anything after I got to Finschhafen, New Guinea. That was the last place I was at, and they needed a cadre to go with one of the army units, one of the divisions, and they said there were 20 of us, about 20 of us. You will be attached to a unit, and we're going to invade the Philippines.
So you were sent to the Philippines from New Guinea. Now,
Yeah.
was that before the island had been liberated entirely?
Yeah, they were talking about they're going to liberate the island, and you lucky people were going to be the ones to go up there with the invading force. And so we did. Now there was something to see. Hundreds, maybe thousands of ships all around, all moving up north toward the Philippines.
Right.
And they landed in an island called Leyte, which is part of the Visayan Island group. There was Luzon in the north, the big island, which was where the capital, Manila, Corregidor, Bataan, and all of that. And in the south, Mindanao, another large island. But there was a group of central islands, which was the Visayan Islands, Cebu, Samar, Leyte, like that. And he hit him in the middle. MacArthur got between the two, right? He did that a lot. Got into the middle there, and we made our landings. And successfully set up an airstrip right on the beach, and back of the airstrip was the ammo dump. And I was sent to, I was put on liaison. And that meant that I would have to hitch a ride on a duck, which was an amphibious boat, and was told with a bill of lading, there's equipment coming in on that particular boat, the Carlos Carrillo or something like that. And we would go out there, and I'd ask the fella, find the Carlos Carrillo. He knew, yeah, it's one over there. It'll take me over there. And we'd climb up and find out where they're going to dump the stuff on the beach, and then they'd bring it in on these and dump them on the beach, the ammunition and the foodstuffs and that sort of thing. But there was action all the time. I remember well once, it was in the morning. We had night fighters out there, and they were coming in from their night patrols, and two of them were coming into our landing strip, and we looked, and right behind those two was a Betty bomber, they called it. It was a Japanese bomber.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no alarms, nothing like that we were being attacked, because radar, what there was of it, showed our two planes coming in and maybe a third one, and it was kind of hidden. And all of a sudden, there it was. So I remember digging down deep in the sand as far as I could, and the plane flew over the ammo dump and over the airstrip and went around, and then dropped a bomb on one of our support ships out in the Gulf, and then another one, and there were two big smoke pouring up, and of course the sky was filled with anti-aircraft shells. It was if you put a screen on a white piece of paper and then painted it black and then lifted the screen off. There was just this pattern of black as they, of course the thing never got away. It finally splashed down in the ocean. A little scary, but of course at the time we it was part of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Another time we'd gotten up into the Central Valley there, and I had some water in my helmet, and I'd been shaving, see, and it was, and water was, good water was hard to come by, so I left it in the helmet, and that night we were attacked, and I ran out to get my helmet, and I picked the helmet up like that, and I threw that soapy water in my eyes, and I put the thing on and burrowed down. And I tell you, sometimes you do some strange things
Yeah.
when you get panic-stricken.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but yeah, and we were out there. We had a typhoon not long after the landing. Oh God, I was on board ship at the time. I don't know, one of the ships, and I stood there on the deck, and there was a ship coming perpendicular to us. And I looked at that ship. Was raining, the wind was blowing, and all of a sudden I could see the anchor chain. It was dragging the anchor, and those links got bigger and bigger and bigger, and my gosh, it looked like they were going to hit us broadside.
Mm-hmm.
And at the last minute, there was some noise on the horns and turning, and just as that ship came in, our ship made its turn. We passed very close by. A little scary at that particular time.
How long did that storm last?
It wasn't long. It was just a matter of hours.
Yeah.
I suppose, maybe 6-8 hours, it was gone.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds long
Yeah.
enough.
I remember I was in Tacloban, the capital
Yeah.
of the island down there, and walking along the street, and all of a sudden a Jeep came by and it had a star on it. Of course, you come to attention and salute. There was a 1-star brigadier general. The next one came along was 2 stars. Next one came along 3 stars. And here along came 4 stars with the pipe, General MacArthur.
Was that the only time you saw him during the war in
Oh,
person?
yeah, he was right down there
Yeah.
in Tacloban and Leyte. And very big as life, of course. We were just bug-eyed to see because, he was our commander, and heard so much about him,
Mm-hmm.
and he knew his stuff. He was a good soldier.
Mm-hmm.
We got in there in October. That was the initial landings, and we fought through November and fought through December, and they were stubborn. And MacArthur, he left the middle part of Leyte, and he sent up to, I can't think of the name of that place anymore, up north, and he made a landing up there and got behind the Japanese, and that finished the campaign. And years later, I was watching on television the Korean War,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden they start showing an Incheon landing, they called
Right.
it. And here he did the same thing. He came up when we were having trouble, and he got into Incheon, got behind the North Korean forces, and won the battle that way.
Mm-hmm.
Used the same thing twice.
Same tactic.
Tactic. Remarkable man. Just remarkable man.
Now, after the Philippines were liberated, you were there.
Yes.
Where were you assigned next?
I stayed, again, as I say, it was every other island. So the war continued. Of course, the Marines were in Iwo Jima, and the Army was up there, a couple of the other places up there in the Okinawa. I think that was an Army operation. Now we're going to invade Japan.
Right.
So we began to prepare these. I guess everybody was prepared for the invasion of Japan when suddenly it came over the radio, the Armed Forces radio. We didn't have radios, but they had speakers around in the area, and the radio was over in the headquarters, the company headquarters, and the bomb had been dropped. And now they're suing for peace. And what a relief. What a relief. And then afterward, we had, if you had so much service, you would be the first ones, first in, first out.
Yeah.
So I got back pretty quickly. And I'll never forget it. It was on Christmas Eve of 1945. And coming back, the ship's lights were all on. It was a wonderful thing to see the lights. And then sailing into the San Francisco Bay, across the Golden Gate and the Bay Bridge there. And here was Oakland on one side on a little hill there, all the lights on. It looked like, it reminded me of a coal fire, you know, with the light underneath coming up. Christmas time, you see, all the lights in San Francisco. And there we came in and docked on Christmas Eve. And Christmas Day, we had to stay on the ship because so many men were coming back, they couldn't handle them at the receiving camps. So we had to spend several days on board ship. And they had sent a call out, evidently, to the people of San Francisco that the soldiers were on board ship and it would be nice if we could show them a Christmas. And we came down, I came down, all of us, we wanted to get off that boat. And we came down the gangplank and looked out, and here was a whole string of automobiles, people of San Francisco coming up, and they would say, 2 soldiers, 3 soldiers, 1 soldier. And with me, I got down there, and I didn't know these fellas. We just came back on our longevity service, 1, 2, 3. And it was a young girl. She took 3 strange soldiers from the Pacific and drove us around, showed us San Francisco, and then took us to her apartment where she laid out a beautiful Christmas dinner for us. Wonderful, wonderful thing. Strangers. Her husband was in the Merchant Marine. She hadn't heard from him for a long time. He was out somewhere. She didn't know where. But she wanted to do her part, and she did it that way. We went to the restaurants, and we'd order a meal, and no cost. No cost. They were so happy because they told us they were frightened of invasion after Pearl Harbor. We and the rest of the country didn't realize how scared those people were. They thought it was going to happen. And I was in Alaska just the other week, 2-3 weeks ago I came back. And those people in Alaska, same thing. The Japanese had taken some of the Aleutians, and they were afraid because the next big city up was Anchorage and Kenai and that area. And boy, we built the Alcan Highway and all, just to, you know, for fear. It was exciting times.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about some everyday things while you were serving there that you probably take for granted or don't think about, but somebody, you know, might. You're talking about shaving. When you were out in the field, were you able to shave every day?
Yeah, we had our little kits. We were issued. We had very interesting issues. We had, of course, the toilet articles were all issued to us, and we couldn't shave every day really because we were busy other things, of course. But when we could, we did. Showers were hard to come by, practically impossible. There was nothing there. You just washed as best you could. An interesting thing when we were there, we received a case of beer when we weren't in action, a case of beer a week. And 2 or 3 of the cans were cold and all the rest of the beer was warm. It's practically sitting on the equator. You can imagine how warm it was.
Yeah.
And another thing, 4 cartons of cigarettes a month. So we could smoke a carton of cigarettes a week. Of course, you had no choice of what some of the oddest and offbeat types of cigarettes, you know. We all looked for Lucky Strikes.
Yeah, that was the
That
preferred.
was the big one. That was preferred because when we were in school, Lucky Strike put on the hit parade. And it was the old Lucky Strike hit parade. LSMFT,
MFT.
Lucky Strike means fine
tobacco.
with men who know tobacco best, it's Lucky's 2-to-1. It's toasted. And of course, it was in a green package. And when the war started, it became a white package of the big advertising campaign just prior to that. Lucky Strike Green has gone to war. Nobody knew what it meant until one day you got your Luckies and it was in a white package and the green dye was all in uniform and paint.
Were they able to keep you fed? Did you always have enough food where you were?
Not always. We were out on the line. There's some skirmishing. I don't remember anymore what it was, but we were away on Thanksgiving. And of course, the advertisement, every man's going to have his turkey dinner. Don't you believe it? We came back about 9 o'clock. It was dark, getting dark by that time, and went into the mess tent. And there was no turkey. Nothing was left. Nothing was there. We got your K rations or your C rations. There was one Thanksgiving we didn't get our turkey.
Didn't get it, huh?
No, but we didn't care. We were alive. You know, that was the big thing.
Yeah.
So many fellas. Oh, another thing I remember was the liberation of Cabanatuan, which was the concentration camp up there in Lausanne. They were afraid that the prisoners were going to be killed, and so they sent what we would call today some kind of a scouting force up there, you know, and they liberated those guys, and they brought them down to where we were. And they were skin and bones. You've maybe seen pictures of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany.
Right.
And that's the way these fellows were, so thin. And it was a shame that they had been starved, you know. Of course, maybe the Japanese were sick too. I don't know. We had I ran into several of them, prisoners, you know, and they all had malaria. We all had malaria. One fella, he wanted to be a translator, and so I said, "How come you know English?" He says, "I went to the Methodist school up there in Japan, in one of their towns up there. One of our the Methodists had evidently a school, a missionary school, and he'd learned English. And he carried a sign around his neck, and it said, 'Interpreter,' and it's written in chalk.
Yeah.
And it was just a piece of wood with a string around his neck, and you see him and you tell him what you wanted the Japanese to do.
How hard was it to get news of current events when you were out there? How often did you get it? For instance, how long did it take for you to hear about D-Day? Do you remember?
Oh, gee, no, we didn't get a lot of news. We did have Armed Forces radio,
Right.
and they carried Armed Forces. The headquarters of the company headquarters had the radio, and we always strung speakers around, 2 or 3 around the camp, hung them from the coconut trees, and what came through was whatever Armed Forces radio wanted us to hear. And we kept up the news that way.
Yeah.
Stars and Stripes were infrequent, the newspaper. We
Right.
didn't get that too often.
Do you remember a radio program called Command Performance that only the servicemen heard?
No, I don't remember that. We didn't get that one. We got a lot of music. Glenn
were
Miller, a lot of
V-discs?
Glenn Miller stuff. That was.
These were V-discs you're talking about, records? Or are you talking about
No,
over the radio?
they came over the radio.
I see.
They came over the radio. Yes, that was. But we were so busy doing other things,
Right.
we didn't have the opportunity really to follow up. We did get the news of the bombing of Hiroshima, and then the next day Nagasaki. That elated us.
While we're speaking of entertainment, did you see any USO shows?
Yeah, down in New Guinea one came through, and the only really famous person I saw. He wasn't even famous, I guess, but there was a fella came down, Alfred Hay Malott, and he came down and he played the piano, and then he had some singers and so on with him. Alfred Hay Malott had written music to the Lord's Prayer. Maybe you know that famous. You've heard the Lord's Prayer being sung.
Yes.
Malott wrote that music.
Wrote the melody. Set
Yeah,
it to
and
that.
he was there, and I knew that, so I was happy to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
But the big ones like Bob Hope and so on, we were so far out where it was we didn't have an opportunity.
Was that the only show you saw? Had the
That's the
chance
only
to see?
one. That's the only one I remember ever seeing. That one, and that was down in New Guinea.
Now, what about mail from home?
Mail from home came well. They
Yeah.
did give us our mail. When we sent it back, I understand it was pretty heavily censored.
Yeah.
But coming in, they had the little VMail or whatever, pictures, tiny stuff. And but it was great. It was great.
Now, VMail, the letter was taken somewhere and it was put on
Photographed.
microfilm. And
Microfilmed
reduced
and set it out, and then they developed it evidently, and then they would deliver it. Packages came in pretty good when people send packages. The mail, they did a good job on the mail in spite of everything. But I don't know. I didn't see any of those shows that they talk about. They may have been great, but we didn't see them.
But you too far away. We got to see Malott there, though.
Yeah, Alfred Hay Malott was his name. I'll never forget it.
Yeah.
Wonderful fella. Wonderful fella. Of course, 90% of the guys, they didn't know who he was. They just liked to hear the music. It was live.
Yeah, sure.
And the show that he brought with him. That was nice.
Now, being out there and not seeing any kind of entertainment, that must have been like water on a dry plant.
Oh,
was
yes,
it?
yeah. It was. We did have movies.
Yeah.
We did have movies. We would set up. Of course, it's so dark. Everything was blacked out, so it was easy. We had generator. We had a wonderful generator that we traded. We had an Allison we had a British generator. We traded it to the Aussies for a wonderfully big generator, and we carried that everywhere. And after the war, it was, maybe it was not even after the war, but there was going to be an inspector general inspection. And we had this big generator unauthorized. How could we explain it? So we had some Japanese prisoners there, and I was in charge. I was only a buck sergeant, so I took them out into the woods. I gave them shovels, and I told them to dig a big hole. And they were frightened. They didn't want to dig that hole.
No.
They thought we were going to dig that big hole and bury them in it. And I told them, no, this generator, we're going to bury that generator. And they thought that was the nuttiest thing they ever heard of. Bury a beautiful big generator like that in the ground? They could not understand it. But we did it. And then when it came time for the inspector general, well, I don't know, must have been lost out of the... We didn't know where the generator was. It's gone someplace.
Gone, huh? How often did you get movies?
Once a week when we weren't, actually on a point, or once we were cut off. We were up in Dulag, and there was a counterattack, and we were cut off, and we were frightened. And they said, just be calm, hide, and we'll be. And the rest of the army came up, and we were no big problem. But the thought of being cut off from your units, scared us a little bit.
Now, what was your rank when you arrived in San Francisco on
I was a
Christmas?
buck sergeant,
Still
three-striper.
sergeant, yeah.
That's all, three-striper.
And how long before, after that Christmas in San Francisco, how long before you got to Rochester and you were out?
Perhaps 3 weeks, maybe 4 on the outside. We got back on Christmas Eve, and about the middle of January, 20th of January, something like that, we were taken cross-country to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and here we are, snow and in tropical uniforms, cold. And so I said, well, we can't go up to western New York like this. They said, well, go down to the depot there, and man, there must have been 1,000 uniforms piled up. So I picked one out, tried it on, and then tried some pants. And there were some shoes and an overcoat. We kept trying them on. They were just the amazing.
Was this leftover
There was
stuff?
leftover
Yeah.
stuff that our nation just was such an outpouring of materiel. There was no chance of the Axis ever winning that war. There was just so much. I saw a movie about the Battle of the Bulge, where my brother was shot up pretty good, and the German commander was being berated because he wasn't moving fast enough, and he called his commander as colonel in. He says, "You see this?" And the guy looked at it. It was a chocolate cake. He says, "We captured this chocolate cake from the Americans." He said, 4 days ago, this chocolate cake left Boston. He said, and now it's on the front lines. He said, these people can send chocolate cakes. We can't beat an army like that. Can't beat it. They had more guns and ammunition and tanks and everything, and now they're bringing in the frills. Chocolate cakes. How can you, yeah.
Lick an army like that. After the war, did you take advantage of like the GI Bill?
There was no question about it. We received, I think it was 2 years of schooling for every year we were in. I was in about 4 years, so I got about 8 years of schooling. So I went out to Illinois, and I went to Elmhurst College, a suburb of Chicago, and I took a bachelor's degree out there. I wanted to be a teacher, and I taught geology for a little while, but my main interest was history and political science, and then I double majored in German language. So I used to belong to a German church, and the church services were in German, so I knew German. Every time I spoke German, I felt I was reciting the 23rd Psalm. It was crazy. But it was church. At any rate, then I came back and went to the U of R, and I took a graduate degree at the university. And then to be a teacher at the school where I'd had a job, they said you have to be an ordained minister because the school belonged to the denomination. And so I went to seminary for 3 years, and that took care of my 8 years. 4 years, 5, 6, 7 in seminary, and U of R 8. I had my 8 years done. I squeezed every dime I could out of the government for my education. But then I went out there to get my job at the college, and the president says, well, school won't start until September, and this is only June you graduated from school. There's a little church out here in the prairie. Why don't you go out there for the summer? And I went out there for the summer, and I had such a wonderful time out there that I came back and said, I can't take the job. He said, why not? I said, because I just enjoy what I'm doing. And from there, I went to a very large church in Chicago, which was the president of the denomination had that church. And they were looking for a pastor, and he said, go out in the prairie, because during the war, he wrote a letter to the servicemen. It was a round-robin letter, and I was one of the few guys that answered it. And we had a little correspondence in 1944, I guess it was. And that was the end of it. And here now in 1957, he remembered that this Vogel out here in Prairie, I remember him from the war. You get him. And from then on, I spent 12 years in that church and 17 in the other one, 17 down here. And where does time go? Where does time go?
Well, speaking of time, we're just about out of time for this interview. I'd like to ask you one last question. Is there any friend that you remember meeting when you were in the service that you'd like to tell us about?
There was a warrant officer named Ben Scammell, who was the assistant band director at Benjamin Franklin High School in Rochester. And my brother was interested in music, and he got to be very friendly with Ben Scammell. And one day I happened to be out in somewhere, and along the beach, I think it was, in Leyte. And I ran into Ben Scammell. He was a warrant officer because, of course, he had the education and so on. He was a teacher when he was drafted into the Army. That was the one fella I remember.
Yeah.
That, I won't forget. He was a good friend. It was so wonderful, I suppose, because you met somebody from home.
From home.
The hometown. When you're all alone, nobody from Rochester or anything like that, or Western New York. And I met old Ben. That was great.
Well, thank you for coming down here
Oh,
to
it's my
share
pleasure.
some of your memories. Again, I'm sure all you folks know who he is here in Perry, but for the Library of Congress and the historians, they'll be looking at this. This is the Reverend Donald Vogel. He's from the First Congregational Church of Perry Center, and we're pleased to have him come down to the studio tonight. I'm Kyle Adamczak, and this is Letchworth Cable Access, and we'd like to thank you for watching. Good night.